They built a home inside a cylinder of corrugated steel. From the outside, it was still a grain silo, a forgotten titan of rust and iron on a fallow patch of land, a relic of a dead industry. But at night, a single, warm light bloomed from a perfectly square window cut halfway up its side, a defiant star in the rural dark. It was a light that said, "We are here." It was a light that said, "We endure." This was the home Frank and Dorothy built after their son and daughter-in-law changed the locks on the house Frank's own father had built, the home where they had lived for 53 years. They did it the day of Frank's brother's funeral, while Frank and Dorothy were 2 states away, burying the last of his siblings. They were cast out, deemed too old, too frail, too much of a burden to occupy the space they had filled with a lifetime of love and labor. Their own son declared them obsolete. But their son never knew about the silo. He never knew about the forgotten acre of land it stood on, a clerical error from a survey done in 1968. He never checked. He underestimated his parents. He underestimated their patience, their knowledge, and the deep, unyielding resilience forged over 7 decades of living a life, not just owning things. He thought he had taken everything. He was wrong. But to understand how a grain silo becomes a fortress of dignity, how an act of profound betrayal becomes the foundation for a new beginning, I have to take you back to the beginning, back to the cold quiet of a long drive home, and a key that no longer fit. The drive back from Ohio was a silent one. Frank drove, his knuckles white on the worn leather of the steering wheel. The silence wasn't angry or sad, not yet. It was hollow. It was the kind of quiet that follows the closing of a casket, the final shovelful of earth. James was gone, the last of the 4 brothers. Frank was the only one left. Dorothy watched the flat, gray fields of Indiana slide by. She had her purse clutched in her lap, a small, worn leather thing that held their entire lives in its zippered compartments. Wallets, a checkbook, a handful of tissues, a tube of lipstick she hadn't touched in days. She thought of James's wife, Martha, looking so small and lost in the cavernous church. She thought of the stale coffee and dry sandwiches in the church basement afterward. Funerals were for the living, people said, but sometimes it felt like they were just a dress rehearsal. He looked peaceful, Dorothy said, her voice a small sound in the humming cab of the truck. Frank grunted. It was a sound she knew well. It meant he agreed, but that the words were lodged somewhere deep in his chest and couldn't get out. He had been a man of few words his entire life. Now, with the world growing quieter around him, he seemed to have even fewer. They had called their son, David, before they left for the funeral. "Of course, Dad. You go. Don't you worry about a thing," he had said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "Karen and I will keep an eye on the place. Water the plants. Feed the cat. You just go be with Aunt Martha." The relief had been immense. David and Karen lived in the city an hour away. They had their own busy lives, their own important jobs. For them to offer, without being asked, felt like a gift. It felt like the love they had poured into their son for 48 years was finally being returned in a moment of need. Dorothy had even baked a casserole and left in the fridge for them. A thank you, a mother's habit. The sun was setting as they turned off the highway and onto the familiar county roads. The light, a deep, bruised orange, caught the tops of the corn stubble in the neighboring fields. Their fields, the ones Frank had walked every day of his adult life. The sight of the farmhouse, nestled in its grove of old oaks, was usually a comfort. It was the end of the journey. It was home. Tonight, something was off. Dorothy felt it first, a prickle of unease. The house was dark, completely dark. Even a small porch light they always left on, the one that had welcomed them home from every trip they had ever taken, was out. "David must have forgotten to leave it on," she murmured. Frank didn't answer. He pulled the truck up the gravel driveway, the tires crunching loudly in the twilight stillness. He shut off the engine. The silence that descended was absolute. No cat meowing at the door. No hum from the refrigerator. Nothing. Frank heaved himself out of the truck, his joints stiff from the long hours of sitting. Dorothy followed, her own knees aching. They walked up the 3 wooden steps to the porch. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out his keyring, the same one he'd carried for 30 years. The brass keys, worn smooth as river stones, were a familiar weight in his hand. He slid the house key into the lock. It didn't go in. He jiggled it. He pushed. Nothing. It was like hitting a wall of solid metal inside the lock. "What in the world?" he muttered, pulling the key out and staring at it, as if the key itself had betrayed him. He tried again. Same result. Dorothy's unease curdled into a cold dread. "Frank? What is it?" "Key's not working." He sounded more confused than alarmed. He stepped back and squinted at the doorknob and the lock plate. They were shinier than he remembered. Newer. Dorothy stepped forward, her heart starting to beat a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She saw, too. The familiar, weathered brass of their old lock set was gone. In its place was a gleaming, silver-colored piece of hardware. New, untouched by their hands. "They changed the lock," she whispered. The words felt alien in her mouth. Nonsensical. Frank stared at the door. He put his hand flat against the wood, as if he could feel the life of the house through it. Then he saw it. Taped to the door, just above the new, impassive lock, was a white envelope. His name was written on it in Karen's neat, precise handwriting. Frank and Dorothy. He tore from the door. His big, calloused fingers, so adept at fixing engines and mending fences, fumbled with the paper. He ripped it open. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, the expensive kind Karen liked, thick and creamy. Dorothy read it over his shoulder. The typed words were cold and clinical. "Mom and Dad, we need to talk, but we decided it was best to do this first, to make a clean break. We've been worried about you for a long time. The farm is too much. The house is too much. You can't manage it anymore, and it's not safe for you to be out here alone. We have made arrangements for you. Your things have been put into a secure storage facility. We've paid for the first 3 months. The cat is with us. He's fine. We found a wonderful senior living community in the city much closer to us. It's called Maple Creek. We've put a deposit down on a 1-bedroom apartment for you. It will be much easier for everyone. This is for your own good. We know this is a shock, but we did it because we love you. We will call you tomorrow to discuss the details. Love, David and Karen." The paper trembled in Frank's hand. Dorothy felt the air leave her lungs. It was a punch of physical blow. She reached out and steadied herself on the porch railing. "For your own good. Because we love you." The words were a grotesque mockery. This wasn't love. This was an eviction. This was an erasure. They hadn't been consulted. They hadn't been asked. They had been disposed of. Like old furniture. Like a problem to be solved. Frank crumpled the letter into a tight ball in his fist. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, on the porch of the home he was no longer allowed to enter, and stared at the new, silver lock that had replaced him. The sun had completely set. They were alone in the dark. The sheriff's deputy was young, his face smooth and untroubled. He leaned against his patrol car, chewing on the end of a pen, looking from the crumpled letter to Frank and Dorothy's tired faces. He had the patient, slightly bored air of a man dealing with a minor domestic squabble. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice flat. "This is your house, but your son changed the locks, and he left this note." "That's right," Frank said, his own voice gravelly. "It's our house. The deed is in our name. We've lived here 53 years. The deputy sighed. He ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. "Look, I understand you're upset, but your son is on the deed too, isn't he? You added him a few years back." Dorothy's stomach tightened. Yes, they had. A lawyer had told them it was a good idea. For estate planning. To make things easier when the time came. It had seemed so sensible then. A practical step. Now that single signature on a piece of paper had become a weapon used against them. "Yes," Dorothy admitted. "But he doesn't live here." "We do." "Ma'am, I hear you," the deputy said, the phrase a shield against empathy. "But if his name is on the deed, he has a legal right to the property. He has a right to access it. Changing the locks, well, it's a gray area. It's a civil matter. A civil matter." The phrase hung in the cold night air. It was a dismissal, a bureaucratic shrug. "So, you're not going to do anything?" Frank's voice was dangerously low. You're not going to let us into our own home. I can, sir, the deputy said, his tone hardening slightly. I can't force entry without a court order. If I do, I'm the one breaking the law. This is something you have to take up with a lawyer. It's a property dispute. It belongs in a courtroom, not on a porch. He clicked his pen. He tucked his notepad away. The conversation was over. My advice? Get a room for the night. Call your son in the morning. Try to talk it out. And if that doesn't work, call a lawyer on Monday. He gave them a final, sympathetic by-the-book nod, got in his car, and drove away, his taillights shrinking down the long, dark driveway until they were just two red sparks that vanished. They were left alone again, standing in the driveway like strangers. The house loomed before them, a dark, silent fortress. It held their clothes, their medicine, their photographs, their bed. It held the ghost of their life. Frank walked slowly back to the truck and opened the passenger door for Dorothy. She climbed in, her body feeling heavy and ancient. He got in beside her and just sat, his hands resting on the steering wheel. A civil matter, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Dorothy looked at the house. She could see the window of the small upstairs bedroom where David had slept as a boy. She had decorated it with baseball pennants. She had read him stories in there. She had sat by his bed when he had the flu. The memories felt like a betrayal now, too. They didn't have family to call. Not nearby. Frank's brother was gone. Dorothy's sister was in a nursing home in Arizona. Her mind clouded. Their friends were their own age, settled in for the night. Not people you called with a crisis like this. A crisis that felt too shameful to even explain. Our son locked us out of our own house. How did you even say that out loud? The motel in town, Dorothy said quietly. The Starlight. It's cheap. Frank started the truck. He didn't look at the house as he backed down the driveway. He put the truck in gear and drove away, leaving the dark shape of the farmhouse behind them. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs, a quarter tank of gas, and about $200 in cash in Dorothy's purse. They were 76 and 78 years old. They were homeless. The Starlight Motel was a long, low building with a buzzing neon sign that had a few dead letters. It spelled out SRLI, MOEL. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. The carpet was a swirl of brown and orange, thin and gritty underfoot. A single, dim lamp cast a jaundiced glow on the particle board furniture. The bedspread was a rough, synthetic fabric printed with faded flowers. Frank sat on the edge of one of the two double beds, his broad shoulders slumped. He looked out of place, a sturdy, weathered oak tree transplanted into a plastic pot. He hadn't said more than 5 words since they left the farm. Dorothy went into the small bathroom. The fluorescent light hummed aggressively. She looked at her reflection in the mirror over the cheap sink. Her face was a web of fine lines. Her hair, usually so neatly coiffed, was flat and messy. Her eyes were red-rimmed and shadowed with exhaustion. She looked like what she was, an old woman who had just had the foundation of her world ripped out from under her. She turned on the tap. The water came out in a sputtering, rusty stream before clearing. She splashed her face with the cold water. It was a shock, but a grounding one. She took a deep breath. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. Despair was a hole they couldn't climb out of. She was the bookkeeper, the planner. Frank was the builder, the doer, but she was the one who managed the numbers, who saw the patterns, who planned for the winter. This was a winter she had never anticipated. She came out of the bathroom and sat at the small, wobbly table. She opened her purse and took out her checkbook and the small ledger she always carried. She clicked her pen. The small, familiar sound was a comfort. Checking account, $1 43256. Savings account, $8 75421. It had always seemed like a comfortable cushion, a safety net for emergencies. A new water heater, a major truck repair. It had never been meant to be their entire world. She began to do the math. The motel was $45 a night. Food, maybe $30 a day if they were careful. Gas for the truck. Then there was the storage unit. David had paid for 3 months. What happened after that? And a lawyer. A lawyer would cost hundreds, maybe thousands. The numbers on the page swam before her eyes. The savings, their life's careful accumulation of pennies and dollars, would be gone in a few months. And then what? They had Social Security, but that barely covered their old property taxes and insurance. On its own, it wasn't enough to live on. Not with rent. They were falling. And for the first time in her life, Dorothy couldn't see the bottom. "Dot." Frank's voice was rough. She looked up. He was watching her, his face a mask of weary defeat. "He called," Frank said. "David. He called the sheriff's department before we did. That boy, the deputy. He knew who we were before we even told him our names. He was just going through the motions." Of course, David was a planner too. He worked in finance. He managed risk. He had anticipated their reaction. He had preemptively painted them as confused, difficult old people. He had neutralized the only authority they could have appealed to. He had thought of everything. The coldness of it was breathtaking. It wasn't an impulsive act of cruelty. It was a calculated strategy. Dorothy closed her ledger. The numbers didn't matter tonight. Tonight, they just had to survive the hours until morning. "We should try to sleep," she said. They lay down in their separate beds, still in the clothes they had been wearing for 2 days. They didn't turn off the lamp. The darkness felt too much like a surrender. Dorothy stared at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the hum of the heater and the distant rumble of trucks on the highway. She thought about her cat, Patches. David had said he was fine, but was he? Was he confused? Did he wait by the door for them? The thought was a small, sharp pain on top of the vast, crushing ache in her chest. She closed her eyes. She didn't pray. She wasn't sure who to pray to. Instead, she began to make a list in her head. It was what she always did when things fell out of control. 1. Call the bank in the morning. Make sure David doesn't have access to their accounts. 2. Go to the library. Use the computer. Look up lawyers specializing in elder law and property rights. 3. Find the deed. She knew there was a copy in their safe deposit box at the bank. They needed to see the exact wording. It was a flimsy plan, a handful of pebbles against a tidal wave. But it was something. It was a step, and then another. That was the only way forward. She focused on the list, repeating it over and over, a mantra against the encroaching despair. It was a long time before she slept. The next few days blurred into a grim routine. They woke up in the stale air of the motel room. They ate a meager breakfast of instant coffee and donuts from the gas station next door. Then they would drive. They drove past the farm once, slowly. A strange car was parked in the driveway. A cleaning service, maybe, or realtors. The thought made Dorothy feel sick. They didn't drive by again. They went to the library. The librarian, a kind woman with gentle eyes, showed Dorothy how to use the public computers. Dorothy spent hours searching, her brow furrowed in concentration. The legal websites were a maze of confusing jargon. Partition action, ouster, tenants in common. Every article seemed to confirm what the deputy had said. It was complicated, expensive, and would take months, if not years, to resolve. And the outcome was not guaranteed. Frank couldn't sit still in the library. The enforced quiet chafed at him. He would pace the parking lot or sit in the truck, staring at nothing. He looked like a man who had lost his purpose. His hands, usually busy with tools or machinery, were empty. They rested on his knees, useless. David did call, as the letter promised. It was the afternoon of the second day. Dorothy answered the cheap motel phone. "Mom, are you there?" His voice was a strange mix of forced cheerfulness and anxiety. "We're here, David," she said, her voice flat. Good, good. I was worried. So, have you had a chance to think? I can send you the link to the Maple Creek community. It's really nice. They have a pool and social activities." He was talking as if they were discussing a vacation, as if he hadn't just detonated their lives. "Why did you do it, David?" Dorothy asked, the question raw and simple. There was a pause. She heard him take a breath. "I told you, Mom. We were worried. Dad's getting frail. You shouldn't be out there alone. What if one of you fell? No one would know for days. This is better. It's safer. You'll be closer to us. We can see you all the time." The lies were so smooth, so practiced. He had convinced himself they were the truth. "You wanted the farm," Dorothy said. It wasn't a question. You wanted to sell it. Another pause, longer this time. "The land is valuable, Mom. It's worth a lot of money. You and Dad are sitting on a gold mine, and you're living on Social Security. It doesn't make sense. This way, you get the care you need, and the equity in the farm can provide for you. Properly. For the rest of your lives. And it helps us out, too. Karen and I, we have plans. There it was. The truth, wrapped in the language of finance and practicality. Their home was not a home. It was equity, an asset to be leveraged. Your father built that house with his own hands, Dorothy said, her voice trembling with a cold fury. We raised you in that house. I know that, Mom, and it was great. But times change. People move on. It's just a house. Just a house. Something inside Dorothy snapped. The careful composure, the bookkeeper's restraint, it all fell away. No, David, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. It was our home, and you are not welcome in it. Do you understand me? You have made your decision. Now live with it. Don't call us again. She hung up the phone. Her hand was shaking. Frank was looking at her, a question in his eyes. He wants to sell, she said. He thinks he's doing us a favor. Frank just nodded, his expression grim. He had known. Of course he had known. He had just been waiting for her to see it too. That night, the despair was closer. It felt like a physical presence in the small, grim room. They were out of options. A lawyer was a fantasy they couldn't afford. A court battle was a war they couldn't win. They were old and tired, and the world was moving on without them. Dorothy lay awake long after Frank's heavy breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep. She stared at the sliver of light under the door. She thought about the deed. They had gone to the bank. The original deed was there, in the safe deposit box, along with their marriage certificate and Frank's honorable discharge from the army. She had held it in her hands. The paper was thick, brittle with age. She remembered something else that was in that box. A second deed, a much smaller one, from the original purchase of the farm back in 1968. Frank's father had bought the main 150-acre parcel from one family and an adjacent, oddly shaped 1-acre plot from another on the same day. The smaller plot had an old, abandoned grain silo on it. It was considered worthless, but the owner wouldn't sell the main fields without someone taking the silo property off his hands too. They had meant to merge the deeds, to consolidate the parcels into one. But there had been a surveyor's strike. Then a baby came, David. Then life happened. They just forgot. The smaller deed, for that one worthless acre, was filed separately. It was in Frank's name, and Frank's name alone. David had never been added to it. He probably didn't even know it existed. An idea, faint and improbable, began to form in her mind. It was a crazy idea, a desperate idea. She got out of bed. She found her purse and her ledger. Using the dim light from the bathroom, she turned to a blank page. At the top, she wrote, "The Silo Project." The silo stood on the far western edge of their property, nearly half a mile from the farmhouse. It was a ghost, a tall, cylindrical monument to a different era of farming. It hadn't been used in 40 years. It was a place where teenagers would sometimes sneak off to, a landmark for giving directions. Turn left at the old silo. It was a part of the landscape, so familiar that no one really saw it anymore. The next morning, Dorothy didn't say anything about it at first. She let Frank drink his coffee. She watched his face. The look of defeat was still there, etched into the lines around his eyes. "Frank," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I want to go to the library again, but not for the computers. I want to look at the county plat maps." He looked at her, confused. "The maps? What for?" "I just want to check something," she said. "Please." He sighed, but he didn't argue. Driving to the library was better than sitting in the motel room. The county records office was in the basement of the library, a cool, quiet room that smelled of old paper and binding glue. Dorothy asked for the plat maps for their township from 1970 to the present day. The clerk wheeled out a large, heavy book. Dorothy spread it open on a wide table. She ran her finger across the intricate grid of lines and numbers, her lips moving silently. Frank stood behind her, watching, his skepticism a tangible presence. She found their parcel, 1,507 acres, labeled with their family name, and right next to it, a tiny, separate square, labeled with a different parcel number, 11 acres. also labeled with their name. It was exactly as she remembered. 2 properties, not one. There, she said, her finger pressing down on the small square. Right there. Frank leaned in. He squinted. That's the silo lot. What about it? Whose name is on that deed, Frank? He thought for a moment. Mina, guess. It was from the original purchase. Your dad and we never got around to merging them. And when we added David to the main deed, she continued, her voice gaining strength, we only added him to the big one. The farmhouse parcel. We never touched this 1 inch. A flicker of understanding crossed Frank's face. He straightened up. He looked at Dorothy, really looked at her for the first time in days. It's ours, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Just ours. He can't touch it. He can't sell it. He doesn't even know it's separate. Frank stared at the map. He traced the outline of the tiny parcel with his thick finger. A single acre, with a giant, rusting metal can on it. That, he said slowly. It's a ruin. The roof is probably shot. It's full of pigeons and God knows what else. It's not a place to live. Is it standing? She asked. Well, yeah, it's standing. Does it have walls? Of a sort, he admitted. Then it's a start, she said. She closed the heavy book. The sound echoed in the quiet room. It's more than we have now. Now, we have a motel room that's costing us $45 a day. Out there, we have land. Our land. The defeated slump in his shoulders began to lessen. A spark of his old self, the builder, the problem solver, returned to his eyes. He wasn't seeing a ruin anymore. He was seeing a challenge. He was seeing a structure. The truck is almost out of gas, he said. Then we'll fill it up, she said. I'm driving you there. We need to see it. He looked at her, at the fierce, unyielding determination in her eyes. And for the first time since they had found the new lock on their door, he smiled. It was a small, tired, rusty smile, but it was there. Okay, Duddy said. Let's go see our new home. They bought gas and 2 hot dogs at the station. They ate in the truck in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with a fragile, terrifying hope. There was an old, overgrown access path that led to the silo from the main road, a path that hadn't been used in decades. Frank had to get out and pull aside thorny branches and thick brush just so the truck could get through. The suspension squealed and groaned as they bumped over the uneven ground. And then they were there. The silo was bigger up close, a colossal tube of corrugated steel rising 60 feet into the air. It was capped with a conical roof that was streaked with rust and bird droppings. The steel walls were a patchwork of weathered gray and deep, angry orange. Weeds and small trees grew in a thicket around its base. It looked less like a building and more like something that had fallen from the sky a long time ago. Lord have mercy, Frank breathed, staring up at it. They got out of the truck. The air was still and heavy. They could hear the buzzing of insects and the distant cooing of pigeons from inside the structure. There was a large, rusted metal door at the base, held shut by a thick chain and a padlock that had long ago seized into a solid lump of rust. Frank went back to the truck and came back with a tire iron. He wedged it into a link of the chain. He put his shoulder into it and heaved. The chain was old and brittle. With a screech of protesting metal, a link snapped. The chain fell away. Together, they pulled on the heavy door. It scraped against the concrete slab, groaning in protest. They managed to open it just enough to slip through. They stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust, decay, and dry rot. A single beam of light lanced down from a hole in the roof, illuminating a swirling galaxy of dust motes. The ground was covered in a thick layer of dirt, debris, and decades of bird droppings. High above, in the shadowy rafters of the roof, they could hear the flutter and panicked cooing of the pigeons they had disturbed. It was a vast, circular space, an empty cylinder. It was a mess. It was a disaster. Frank stood in the center, slowly turning, taking it all in. Dorothy watched him, her heart pounding. She had brought them here. She had staked their last hope on this crazy idea. If he said no, if he said it was impossible, that would be it. The end. He walked over to one of the steel walls. He ran his hand over the cool, corrugated metal. He kicked at the concrete floor with the heel of his boot. It was solid. He looked up, squinting at the roof structure 60 feet above. "The bones are good," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Steel walls. Concrete slab. The roof trusses look okay from here. That hole can be patched." He looked at Dorothy. The spark in his eyes had grown into a small, steady flame. "We can do this," he said. "We can make this a place." Dorothy felt a wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled her knees. She hadn't realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out in a long, shaky sigh. "What's the first step?" she asked. "First step," he said, looking around at the filth and debris. "We need a broom, and a shovel, and about 100 trash bags." That night, they didn't go back to the motel. They bought brooms, shovels, work gloves, and a box of heavy-duty trash bag from a hardware store. They also bought a cheap cooler, a block of ice, some bread, peanut butter, and a case of bottled water. They spent the last of their cash. They went back to the silo. Frank propped the door open to let in the last of the daylight, and they began to work. They swept and shoveled. The dust was so thick they had to tie handkerchiefs over their faces. They filled bag after bag with dirt, old nests, feathers, and unidentifiable debris. It was back-breaking, filthy work, but it was work with a purpose. Every shovelful was an act of defiance. Every bag they filled was a piece of their old life being discarded and a piece of their new life being claimed. They worked until they couldn't see anymore. They were covered in filth, their muscles screaming in protest. They collapsed onto the front seats of the truck, utterly exhausted. They ate peanut butter sandwiches and drank lukewarm water. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. They were partners again. They had a project. That night, they slept in the truck parked just outside the open door of the silo. It was uncomfortable. The seats were lumpy. It got cold, but Dorothy slept more deeply than she had in a motel. When she woke up in the gray light of dawn, the first thing she saw was the dark, solid shape of the silo against the sky. It wasn't a ruin. It was a promise. It was their fortress, and they were home. The next day, they faced a hard reality. Their cash was gone. Their checking account was nearly empty. The real work, the building, the patching, the framing, require materials. Wood, screws, insulation, a patch for the roof. And they couldn't afford any of it. "We need to go to Hobbs Hardware," Frank said, wiping sweat from his brow. They had spent the morning dragging the last of the trash bags out of the silo. The concrete floor was finally visible, a vast, gray circle. "Frank, we don't have any money," Dorothy reminded him gently. "I know," he said, "but I need to talk to Earl." Earl Hobbs was a man carved from the same timber as Frank. He was in his late 70s, but he still ran the hardware store his father had started. He had known Frank for 60 years. They weren't close friends, but they were part of the same generation, the same community of men who understood things like soil composition and engine torque. They walked into the store, dusty and disheveled. The place smelled of sawdust, oil, and fertilizer. It was a sanctuary of competence. Earl was behind the counter, helping a young man find the right kind of wood screw. He looked up as they came in, and his eyebrows rose in surprise. "Frank, Dorothy, haven't seen you two in a coon's age. Heard you were out of town." "We were Earl," Frank said. "We got back." Earl finished with his customer and then leaned on the counter, his gaze shrewd. He took in their work clothes, the dirt under their fingernails, the exhaustion on their faces. Earl was a man who noticed things. "Heard some strange rumors," Earl said, his voice low. David was showing your place to some folks from a big development company. The small town grapevine. Faster than the internet and twice as accurate." Frank's jaw tightened. "That's about the size of it, Earl." There was a long silence. Earl just looked at him, waiting. "We're not living at the house anymore," Frank said finally, the admission costing him. "We're clearing out the old silo on the west parcel." Earl's expression didn't change. He just nodded slowly, as if this was the most logical thing in the world. "The old Alice Chalmers one? Haven't thought about that thing in years. Always figured strong wind would take it down." "The bones are good," Frank said, the phrase becoming his creed. "So what do you need?" Earl asked. Here it was, the moment of truth. "Earl, I'll be straight with you," Frank said, meeting his old acquaintance's eye. "We're broke." The bank account is about dry, but I need to get that silo livable. I need lumber, 2x4s, plywood. I need roofing tar and a sheet of galvanized steel. I need screws, a lot of screws. He paused. I need a line of credit. Dorothy held her breath. It was a huge ask. It was asking for a leap of faith based on a 60-year acquaintance and a shared understanding of how the world ought to work. Earl didn't look at a computer. He didn't ask for a credit check. He picked up a pencil and a small notepad from the counter. "You always paid your bills, Frank," he said simply. "Your dad, too. What size plywood?" Tears pricked at Dorothy's eyes. It wasn't charity. It was something more profound. It was a vote of confidence. It was an act of solidarity. It was one decent man recognizing another and deciding to stand with him. 3/4 inch, Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "All right," Earl said, scribbling on the pad. "I'll start a tab for you. Frank and Dorothy Miller. The Silo Project." He looked up, a ghost of a smile on his face. "Pay me when you can." They left the store with the truck bed loaded with lumber, roofing supplies, and a newfound sense of hope. The first ally had been found. They were no longer entirely alone. The work began in earnest. Frank was a man reborn, with tools in his hands and a problem to solve. The fog of defeat lifted completely. He was in his element. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of practice. First, the roof. He fashioned a makeshift harness from old rope and had Dorothy anchor it to the truck's bumper. He climbed the rickety service ladder, welded to the side of the silo, 60 feet up. Dorothy watched from the ground, her heart in her throat. He was 78 years old, scaling a metal tube, but he moved with the confidence of a man half his age. He spent a whole day up there under the hot sun, cleaning the area around the hole, and then meticulously applying layers of thick black roofing tar. He cut the sheet of galvanized steel to size and bolted it down, sealing the patch. When he was done, he shouted down to her, "That'll hold till kingdom come." Then came the interior. The silo was 30 feet in diameter, a giant circle. Frank stood in the middle of the clean concrete floor, a piece of chalk in his hand, while Dorothy directed him from the doorway, using a sketch she had drawn in her ledger. "The kitchen area along that wall," she'd say, "and the bathroom here. We need to leave a big open space in the middle. The living area." Frank began to frame the walls with the 2x4s from Earl's. The sound of his hammer echoed in the steel cylinder, a rhythmic, purposeful drumbeat. Bang, bang, bang. It was the sound of a home being born. He framed a small, square room for a bathroom. He framed a long wall that would separate a future bedroom from the main living space. He framed openings for a door and windows. Dorothy was the logistics manager. She kept a running tally of their supplies in her ledger. She organized the tools. She made sandwiches. And she watched. She watched as Frank, with nothing but his hands and his knowledge, began to impose order on the chaos. He was turning an empty, circular void into a place with rooms, with corners, with a purpose. Cutting the openings for the windows was the hardest part. The steel walls were a 1/4 inch thick. Frank used a reciprocating saw with a blade designed for metal. The noise was deafening, a high-pitched scream of tormented steel. Sparks flew. It took him 2 full days to cut 2 4x4-foot squares out of the wall. But when the last cut was made and the heavy steel square fell away, light flooded into the space. They stood in the beam of sunlight, dust motes dancing around them. It was no longer a dark, hollow tube. It was a room with a view. Through the opening, they could see the green expanse of the fields and the distant line of trees. "It needs glass," Frank said, wiping his face. "We'll find some," Dorothy said, her voice full of a confidence she hadn't felt in years. Their small ecosystem began to attract notice. One afternoon, a battered pickup truck, even older than theirs, rumbled up the access path. A young woman got out. She looked no older than 20. She was visibly pregnant, and her face was smudged with dirt and tears. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "My car, it broke down on the road. I saw the track back here. I thought maybe... Is there a house back here? Can I use a phone?" Dorothy looked at her. She saw the fear in the young woman's eyes, the faint bruise on her cheek she tried to hide with her hair. This was not just a broken-down car. This was a person on the run. "There's no phone," Dorothy said gently, "but there's water, and a place to sit for a while. Come on in." The young woman's name was Maya. She drank 3 bottles of water, one after another. She told them her story in fits and starts. A boyfriend who got mean when he drank. A fight the night before. She had packed a bag and just drove until the car died. She had nowhere to go. Frank went and looked at her car. "Cracked block," he announced when he came back. "It's not going anywhere." Maya started to cry, silent, hopeless tears. "You'll stay here tonight," Dorothy said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We don't have much, but it's safe." Maya stayed the night. She stayed the next day. She watched them work, her eyes wide with a kind of wonder. On the 3rd day, she picked up a broom and started sweeping up Frank's sawdust without being asked. "I can help," she said. "I'm a good cook when I have a kitchen. I can organize things." She became their first resident. She was quiet and sad sometimes, but she was also a source of youthful energy. She took over the management of their cooler-based food supply. She helped Dorothy measure things. She talked to the baby in her belly, telling it about the strange, kind people who were building a house inside a tin can. A week later, another stray found them. A boy named Leo. He couldn't have been more than 17. He had a backpack and a defiant look in his eyes that didn't quite hide the fear. He had been sleeping in the woods. His parents had kicked him out when they found out he had a boyfriend. He had seen the light from their window at night and came to investigate, expecting to find other kids partying. Instead, he found an old man framing a wall, an old woman making notes in a ledger, and a pregnant girl humming to herself as she sorted screws into coffee cans. "What is this place?" he asked, bewildered. "It's a work in progress," Frank said, not missing a beat with his hammer. Leo had nowhere to go either. He was hungry. They shared their peanut butter sandwiches with him. He was good with his hands, a quick learner. He noticed Frank was struggling to run a single, long extension cord from a small, noisy generator outside. "I could do that better," Leo said. "My uncle's an electrician. He taught me some stuff." The next day, using some wiring they got from Earl's on credit, Leo rigged up a simple circuit board. He ran wires along the new wooden studs. Suddenly, they had 3 working outlets and 2 bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. It felt like a miracle. A new ecosystem was forming. A community of the discarded, drawn together by chance and necessity. Frank was the builder. Dorothy was the planner. Maya was the hearthkeeper. Leo was the engineer. They were a strange, broken, and beautiful family. The silo was no longer just a project. It was becoming a home. Dorothy found old, discarded windows at the town dump that fit the openings Frank had cut. Frank built frames for them and caulked them into place. Maya found a patch of clear ground outside and started a small garden with seeds she bought with the last of her own money. Leo figured out how to rig a simple water pump from a well Frank had discovered, using a car battery for power. They were building more than a house. They were building a life from scratch. They were proving that you could take the things society had thrown away, a rusty silo, a pregnant girl, a gay teenager, 2 old folks, and build something strong and whole and good. The news of their project and their strange, growing family inevitably trickled back to David. It wasn't the triumphant phone call he had expected, begging to be let into the Maple Creek senior community. It was a rumor, a piece of small-town gossip that he at first dismissed as absurd. His parents, living in the old silo? It was preposterous. But the rumor persisted. Finally, driven by a mixture of curiosity and irritation, he and Karen drove out from the city. They couldn't get down the main farm driveway. Frank and Dorothy still had the only key to the gate at the road. So they had to park on the shoulder and walk down the overgrown access path to the silo. What they saw stunned them into silence. The silo was no longer just a rusty hulk. It had windows now with glass in them. A sturdy, newly built wooden door stood where the old, rusted one had been. A thin plume of smoke rose from a makeshift chimney pipe Frank had installed for a small wood stove. There was a small, neat garden nearby, with a young pregnant woman tending to it. A teenage boy was tinkering with a solar panel propped up on a stand. And on a small, newly built porch sat his parents. They were sitting in two old rocking chairs that Dorothy had salvaged from the dump and cleaned. They weren't broken. They weren't frail. They looked content. David and Karen walked forward, their city shoes crunching on gravel. "Mom? Dad?" David's voice was uncertain. Frank and Dorothy stopped rocking. They looked at their son and his wife. They looked at their expensive clothes, their shocked faces. "David," Frank said. His voice was even, not angry, just stating a fact. What is all this?" Karen asked, her voice a high-pitched squeak. She gestured around at the scene, at the silo, at Maya and Leo, who had stopped what they were doing and were watching them with wary eyes. "This is insane. You're living in a farm implement." "We're living in our home," Dorothy said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is not a home. This is a public health hazard," David exclaimed, his voice rising. He was losing control of the narrative, and it infuriated him. "We had a beautiful apartment waiting for you. Safe, clean, with nurses." "We don't need nurses, David," Frank said. "We need a roof over our heads. A roof you took from us. We were trying to help you." David insisted, his face turning red. "You can't take care of yourselves. You're going to get hurt out here. This whole thing it's embarrassing." The word hung in the air. Embarrassing. That's what it came down to. They were an embarrassment to his new, successful life. An untidy problem he had tried to neatly file away. "We have a survey of the whole property scheduled for next week," David said, changing tactics. "The developers need it before the sale can go through. They'll find this. They'll find you, and they will have you removed." Dorothy looked at him, her expression unreadable. "This acre isn't part of your survey, David. This acre isn't part of your sale. This acre is ours, and you can't touch it." The certainty in her voice finally seemed to penetrate his anger. He looked confused. "What are you talking about? It's all one property." "No," Dorothy said simply. "It's not. You should have checked the county records more carefully." The realization dawned on David's face, followed by a wave of pure fury. He had been outmaneuvered by his own mother. He had underestimated her. He had seen a frail old woman, not the meticulous bookkeeper who had balanced the farm's books to the penny for 50 years. He turned that fury on the only target he could. "You can't do this," he shouted, not at his parents, but at the silo itself. "This can't be legal. I'll call the county. I'll call the zoning board. I'll have this place condemned." He had finally said it, the threat he had been holding back. If he couldn't have the land, he would make sure they couldn't either. He would use the system to destroy what they had built. He and Karen turned and stormed back toward the road, leaving a trail of angry silence behind them. Frank watched them go. He looked at Dorothy. "He'll do it," he said. "I know," she said. She reached over and put her hand on his. "So we'd better get ready. If you've made it this far in the story, you're as invested in Frank and Dorothy's home as they are. This is the turning point where the community they've built has to stand up to the system that's designed to crush them. What would you do in this position? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this journey, please hit that subscribe button and stick around to see how it all turns out. The official notice arrived a week later. It was delivered by a county sheriff, not the young, dismissive one, but an older, grim-faced man. The paper was thick, official, and plastered with red letters. It was a condemnation notice. It cited a dozen different code violations: improper sanitation, lack of a certified septic system, unsafe electrical wiring, improper egress. The structure was designated for agricultural use only, not as a human dwelling. They were given 30 days to vacate the premises. After that, the county would have the authority to demolish the structure at the owner's expense. David had been true to his word. He had unleashed the full, impersonal weight of the bureaucracy upon them. They all read the notice, standing in the middle of their living space. Maya's face was pale with fear. Leo was angry, his fists clenched. Frank just read it over and over, his expression grim. Dorothy folded the paper neatly and placed it on the table. "Henderson," she said. "That's the inspector's name. Robert Henderson." "It's over," Maya whispered. "They're going to kick us out. No, Dorothy said, her voice ringing with a sudden, fierce authority that made them all look at her. It's not over. It's a list. That's all it is. A list of problems. And we are problem solvers. She turned to Frank. Can we do these things? Can we fix them? Frank looked at the list. He traced the words with his finger. Septic. That's a big one. That's digging. That's a permit. Electrical. Leo's work is good, but it's not to code. An inspector would want it in conduit. Egress. The windows are big enough, but the bedroom needs its own door to the outside. He paused, looking around the home they had built. It's a lot of work, Doc. For 30 days. I don't know. We're not alone, Leo said, his voice quiet but determined. The community rallied. It started with Earl Hobbs. Frank took the notice to the hardware store. Earl read it, his lips a thin, hard line. Henderson, he grunted. He's a by-the-book man. Tough, but he's fair. And he hates developers more than he hates code violations. He tapped the paper. This is David's doing. Henderson wouldn't have come out here on his own. Someone with a financial interest had to file a formal complaint. Earl made a phone call, then another. I know some fellas, he said. Retired. A plumber. An electrician. They're bored. And they don't like seeing good people get pushed around. The next day, 2 pickup trucks rumbled up the path. One belonged to a man named Gus, a retired master plumber with a belly that shook when he laughed. The other belonged to a quiet, wiry man named Sal, the retired electrician Leo's uncle had apprenticed under. They looked at the condemnation notice. They looked at Frank's work. They walked through the silo, nodding, occasionally grunting in approval. The boy's got a knack, Sal said to Leo, pointing at the wiring. But we got to pull it all and run it through conduit. Inspector Henderson sees this. He'll have a fit. Septic's the real bear, Gus said, scratching his chin. Need a perk test. Need a permit. Need a backhoe. I know a guy with a backhoe. Suddenly, the impossible list seemed possible. It was a flurry of activity. Gus, the plumber, showed Frank and Leo how to lay out the lines for a small, efficient septic system. Sal, the electrician, worked with Leo, teaching him how to bend conduit and run the wiring to meet the exacting standards of the National Electric Code. Earl Hobbs extended them more credit, delivering pipes, wires, and junction boxes. Maya, her belly growing larger by the day, became the project manager. She kept the work site clean. She made sure everyone had water and food. She even started a blog, a simple online diary with pictures, telling the story of the silo project. She told the story of Frank and Dorothy, of their eviction, of the home they were building, and of the condemnation notice that threatened to destroy it all. The story found an audience. A local reporter, who had seen Maya's blog, came out to do a story. The article, titled Silo Home, Last Stand or New Beginning, was published in the regional paper. It was a sympathetic piece. It painted David and Karen as greedy and heartless. It portrayed Frank and Dorothy as resilient pioneers. The community response was immediate. People started showing up. A local church group arrived one Saturday, with 24 casseroles and an offer to help paint. A retired carpenter came and helped Frank frame and hang the new egress door in the bedroom. A landscaping company dropped off a load of topsoil from Maya's garden for free. The silo was no longer an isolated outpost. It had become a cause. It was a symbol of defiance against greed, of community against isolation. Every nail hammered, every pipe laid, was a testament to their collective will. They worked from sunup to sundown. Frank, powered by a purpose he hadn't felt in years, seemed to grow stronger. He directed the work, his quiet competence earning the respect of the seasoned tradesmen who had come to help. Dorothy managed the budget, which was now a complex web of credit from Earl and small cash donations that had started to arrive in the mail from strangers who had read the article. With 3 days to spare before the deadline, they were done. The septic system was in, the leach field laid. The wiring was a work of art, neat and orderly in its gray metal conduit. The plumbing was functional, with hot and cold running water fed by a new on-demand water heater. The insulation was in, the drywall was up, and the walls were painted a warm, cheerful yellow. It was a home, a real, functional, and safe home. The final test was the inspection. Dorothy called Robert Henderson's office and scheduled it for the last possible day. The morning of the inspection, the air was thick with tension. Gus and Sal came back just to be there. Earl Hobbs closed the store for an hour and drove out. Maya, Leo, Frank, and Dorothy stood on the porch waiting. Henderson arrived exactly on time. He was a tall man with a clipboard and an expression that gave nothing away. He got out of his county vehicle and walked slowly toward the silo, his eyes taking in everything. The new door, the clean windows, the small, thriving garden. "Morning," he said, his voice neutral. "I'm here to perform the final inspection." "We're ready for you, Mr. Henderson," Frank said. Henderson started on the outside. He walked the perimeter of the new septic field. He checked the exterior electrical conduit. He measured the windows. He didn't say a word. He just made notes on his clipboard. Then he came inside. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes adjusting to the light. He had been expecting a makeshift camp, a hovel. What he saw was a clean, bright, open living space. He saw a small, efficient kitchen with a sink and a working stove. He saw walls, real walls, with properly installed outlets. He saw a ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. He ran his hand along a wall. He flipped a light switch on and off. He went into the bathroom and flushed the toilet. He heard the water run, the tank refill. He saw the GFI outlet next to the sink. He spent nearly an hour going over every detail. He checked the circuit breaker box Al and Leo had installed. He measured the distance between the studs in the one wall that was still open. He checked the seals on the windows. Finally, he stood in the middle of the room. He clicked his pen. He looked at his clipboard, covered in notes. He looked up at Frank and Dorothy. "When I came out here a month ago," he said slowly, "I saw an unsafe, derelict agricultural building being used as an illegal shelter." He paused. The silence in the silo was absolute. "Today," he continued, "I see a single-family dwelling that meets, or, in some cases, exceeds the residential building code for this county." He looked directly at Frank. "Your framing is better than half the contractors I inspect. Your electrical is immaculate. Whoever did your plumbing knows his business." He made one final check mark on his form. He ripped the top sheet off and handed it to Dorothy. "This isn't a silo anymore, ma'am," he said. "This is a house. As far as the county is concerned, you're clear." He gave a curt nod, turned, and walked out. The moment the door closed, a cheer went up. Gus clapped Frank on the back, so hard he nearly fell over. Leo and Maya were hugging. Dorothy looked down at the paper in her hand. At the top, in a box marked status, Henderson had written one word: approved. Tears streamed down her face. They were tears of exhaustion, of relief, of a profound and deeply earned victory. They had faced the system, and they had won, not by fighting it, but by meeting its demands with competence and integrity. The aftermath was swift. The newspaper ran a follow-up story: Silo Home approved. Community rallies to save couple's dream. The story went viral. David and Karen were publicly and thoroughly shamed. The development company, not wanting to be associated with the bad press, pulled out of the deal to buy the farm. David was left with a piece of property he couldn't sell, a mortgage he was struggling to pay on his own city house, and a reputation in the small town that was utterly destroyed. The farm he had stolen had become a financial and social albatross around his neck. Justice, Dorothy reflected, was sometimes just the natural consequence of one's own actions. Life in the silo settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The changing seasons brought new beauty to their small kingdom. The summer was warm, and Maya's garden overflowed with tomatoes and zucchini. The autumn turned the distant trees into a blaze of color, a spectacle they watched from their porch every evening. The winter brought a quiet blanket of snow, and they were snug and warm inside their insulated steel home, the wood stove crackling merrily. Maya had her baby in the late summer, a healthy little girl she named Hope. The silo, once a hollow and silent place, was now filled with the sound of a baby's laughter. Gus and Sal became honorary grandfathers, stopping by with diapers and unsolicited advice. Earl Hobbs would drop off supplies and stay for a cup of coffee. The silo had become the new town center, a place of warmth and welcome. Leo, with a glowing letter of recommendation from Sal, got accepted into a prestigious trade school's electrical program. He still spent weekends at the silo, constantly tinkering and improving their off-grid systems. He had found not just a home, but a vocation. They added on. Frank, with help from Leo and other volunteers, built 2 small, well-insulated bedrooms adjoining the silo, using the same post and beam style. One for Maya and Hope, one for Leo. The silo itself remained the great room, the heart of the home. Frank and Dorothy never spoke of David. His name was a ghost they had chosen to exorcise. The betrayal was a scar, but it was a scar on a body that had healed and grown stronger. They had lost a house, but they had gained a home. They had lost a son, but they had gained a family. One day, about a year after the inspection, a small, unfamiliar car pulled up the path. A young woman got out. It was Emily, David and Karen's daughter, Frank and Dorothy's granddaughter. They hadn't seen her since before the funeral. She was in her early 20s, a college student. She approached the porch timidly. "Grandma? Grandpa," she said, her eyes filled with tears. Dorothy stood up and opened the screen door. "Hello, Emily. I'm so sorry." Emily sobbed, the words tumbling out. What they did, it was wrong. I told them it was wrong. I haven't spoken to him in months. I read the articles. I saw what you built. I had to come. I had to see you." Dorothy didn't say, "It's okay." She didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply held the door open wider. "The coffee is on," she said. "Come on in." Emily started visiting regularly. She brought her college textbooks and studied at the big kitchen table Frank had built. She played with baby Hope. She listened to Frank's stories. She helped Dorothy in the garden. She was rebuilding the bridge her father had burned. She never spoke of him, and they never asked. The open door was forgiveness enough. The bond, frayed but not broken, began to mend. One cool evening in late spring, a few years later, Frank and Dorothy were sitting on their porch, as they so often did. The silo was quiet. Hope was asleep. Leo was away at school. Maya was reading a book inside. The air was sweet with the smell of freshly turned earth and blooming lilacs from a bush Emily had planted for them. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the fields. In the distance, they could see the dark, empty shape of their old farmhouse. A "for sale by owner" sign had been in the yard for over a year, looking faded and forlorn. Frank had built a small, permanent light fixture next to the porch door. He had wired it to a solar panel and a battery. It came on automatically at dusk, a steady, welcoming glow. Dorothy reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a small, creased photograph. It was a picture of her and Frank, taken the year they were married. They were young, impossibly young, standing in front of an old tractor, squinting into the sun, their whole lives ahead of them. She looked from the young faces in the photo to the wrinkled, familiar face of the man sitting beside her. He followed her gaze to the old farmhouse, then back to the silo, to the warm light spilling from its windows, to the home they had made from nothing. He reached over and took her hand. His was rough and calloused, hers was soft and thin, but they fit together perfectly, as they always had. "It's a good life," he said, his voice quiet. She squeezed his hand, her gaze resting on the solid, curved wall of their strange, wonderful home. The steel was cold, but the home was warm.